To Math with Miss Swartz. Today we're going to be looking at adding and subtracting fractions. I know that can be scary for some of you, but if we can take our time, work through the process, we'll get a really good understanding of how to add and subtract fractions. Remember, fractions are no different than whole numbers. We're just working with parts instead of wholes. So if we're talking about fractions, we may think about a picture in our heads. So if we're talking about 1/3, you can think about this picture here. See how the rectangle is separated into thirds, and right now what's colored in is 1/3 of it. You could also think about 2/3 here, or 3/3, which would just be considered one whole. So if you can kind of get that idea in your head, maybe fractions will seem a little less scary to you. So let's get started when we're talking about adding and subtracting fractions. So how do we add and subtract fractions? Remember, our biggest piece of adding and subtracting fractions is finding a common denominator. Okay, I know it can be hard to spell denominator and numerator. Do your best. Okay, common denominators are very important. If we look at an example like 3/4 plus 1/8. If I were to draw those pictures out, okay, 3/4 is here. I have 3 of them colored in out of the 4. And 1/8 okay, would look like this. So notice we're not comparing the same thing here. It's really hard to tell what we would add because our pieces look different. So we need a common denominator. We're going to use our denominators. If we look at them, we want to find a multiple that both numbers have. Okay, so in this case, it's pretty easy. Both numbers have a multiple of 8. So this one doesn't change, but this one does. So what did we do to 4 to get to 8? Well, we multiplied by 2, and a lot of times I like to write that over to the side. So what we did was we added some more boxes in here. So now we have the same number of boxes across, so we can compare them a little easier. Notice the shading didn't change, we just have more boxes. So we have to double the numerator as well. If we do it to the denominator, it has to be done to the numerator. So now I could, it's hard to see, but I could count the number of boxes that are shaded, or I could just add my numerators. So 7/8 would be our answer. So the same thing works with subtraction. We need to make sure we have a common denominator. So if we were doing a problem like 2/3 minus 5/6, we would need a common denominator. So I could draw the pictures, but I don't think we want to do that every time. So we just need to think, okay, I don't have matching denominators here. What number is a multiple of both of these numbers that I can have a common denominator with? Well, 5/6 is going to stay the same, but 3 needs to become 6 to match it. So what do I do to 3? In this case, same thing I did before, multiply by 2. You won't always multiply by 2, but you might. And I'll do the same thing to the numerator. So now you're going to have some integers involved with our fractions as well, so there's a lot of things you have to remember. So in this case, we might do keep, change, change. Well, then I have different signs and I'm adding my numerators, so that's important to remember. We're only adding or subtracting the numerator. Okay? We don't add or subtract the denominator. We get those common denominators and then we don't need to worry about it anymore. So 4 plus -5, I'm looking there. They are different signs, so I'm going to subtract, which is 1/6. Then I just have to decide, is it positive or negative? Well, -5 is a bigger value than 4, so it's going to be negative. Alright, so we're going to move on to some examples. We're going to do a few together, you're going to try a few on your own. So if we look at number 1 here, we do not have common denominators. We don't want to draw those pictures every time. So we're going to go ahead and say that 8 is going to be our common denominator. So we can leave that alone. What do I need to do to 4 to get to 8? I'm going to multiply by 2. And then in the numerator, I'm going to do the same thing. 1 times 2 is 2. Now I have common denominators. I can look at my numerators and see what I can do from there. So negative 7 plus 2 is going to be 5. And that is going to be negative because they're different signs. I subtracted and I kept the sign of the larger absolute value. And then make sure it's simplified and I'm good. Okay, if we look at number 2, it looks a little different than the others you've seen. So number 2, we have a mixed number and an improper fraction. So with adding and subtracting fractions, we can change to mixed numbers or we can change to improper. We can do it either way. It doesn't really matter. A lot of times I like to work with whatever's easiest. So in this case, since this is already improper and I kind of like working with improper better, I'm going to change my mixed number to improper. So you may remember to do that we multiply the denominator times the whole number and add the numerator. Well, why do we do that? Okay, if we draw out 6 boxes here that are all in thirds. Why thirds? Because my fraction's in a third. I can show you why we would do this. Okay, so I actually drew 7 boxes because I have 6 holes and then an extra piece. So if I shade all of these in, okay, because that's a hole, there's 2 holes, there's 3 holes, there's 4, 5, 6, okay, and then 1/3 I shade in. Okay, I multiply these first because I need to figure out how many thirds 6 holes has. So if I count here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. 6 times 3 is in fact 18. Why do I add this one? Because that's how many parts we have left over. So I would actually end up with 19 thirds. We keep our denominator. So luckily our denominator is already common. We don't have to do anything there. We can just look at our numerators. Negative 19 plus 20. We're going to subtract. We get 1. And our positive number is bigger. And so 1/3 is our answer. So I want you to try number 3 here. Hopefully you already wrote 1 and 2 down. I want to remind you that a whole number here can be made into a fraction if you put it over 1. From there, you're going to have to find a common denominator. If you have questions, be sure to raise your hand. So if we go on to a subtraction example, I'll show you working with this whole number here. So here, if I make this into a fraction by putting it over 1, I can work with this. I'm subtracting, I need to find a common denominator. So my common denominator here is going to be 7. So if I multiplied 1 by 7, I have to do the same thing to the numerator. I'll get negative 49 minus 5 over 7. So here I have to follow my integer rules. If I'm subtracting, I'm going to do keep, change, change. I have the common denominator, so now I can just work with my numerators. Negative 49 plus negative 5 is negative 54, because I same sign add and keep. And something I haven't told you is I am okay if you leave them as improper, as long as they are in simplest form. So if these are as simplified as they can be, you're good to go. So I'm going to challenge you a little bit with 2 and 3. We may do some of them as a class, but I want you to try them on your own. If you have questions, feel free to answer. Make sure you have common denominators. You do not have to change these mixed numbers to improper fractions. See what you can do. If you have questions, raise your hand. If you get them done and you want to show one of the teachers, that is great. Make sure you show us all your notes. Have a great day. Let's say.